Today we're sitting down with Wendell Berry. I'm Mike Klein along with Brian Wood. And Wendell has been a family friend of ours. I don't remember the first time you and Tanya.
1983.
83. Mm-hmm. And I think Dad met Gene Logston in 1980. And then...
no, it was at Oberlin in 1983.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah.
So... we're just really glad to have the opportunity to sit down here with you. And if you could just give us a little bit of an introduction about the area here as well. And then we're going to get into, the past 100 years of agriculture here, right, what we see in the future, and just kind of talk about what you've seen. So, Wendell, thanks for joining us.
Well, you're more than welcome, as you know. Well, we're talking here in Henry County, Kentucky, that was one of the larger producers of burley tobacco, this county, in the old days when the program was still in effect and so on. I don't know how it ranks now. There's still some tobacco grown around here, but it's grown on contracts, and the asking price is gone. But this is a county topographically very broken up into ridges and creek valleys, drainages that are too steep for anything but trees or grass. And it's a county that that calls for careful use. I asked a very good farmer years ago if he thought we could safely break 10% of this county in any year, and he said more like 5. So it's a county that needs to be in grass. Tobacco was an ideal crop because of its small acreages. To fit the agriculture here that was highly diversified in animals, sheep, cattle, and hogs, and in the earliest part of my life, the work stock, horses and mules also. Now, now the tobacco program has gone. Tobacco is no longer a standard source of income on every farm. The old diversity of livestock and crops is gone, and mostly the agriculture here now divides between people who are still raising cattle, cow-calf operations mostly, and farmers who've gone to planting soybeans and corn. This has happened over about the last 6 years, maybe. Planting soybeans and corn on fields that had been mainly in grass or entirely in grass all my life. This is very hard to watch.
Now, you grew up here. Were you away from this area growing up and then
No.
moved back? You were here your whole life?
I'm a native of this county, and my mother was born and grew up at Port Royal, just at the top of the hill. My father was born and grew up at what we call our home place, about 5 miles from here, about 4 miles on the other side of Port Royal. And I lived here constantly until I was 14 years old, at which time I was alarmed to discover that by my misbehavior in school and my very bad grades, I had earned myself a trip to a military school. And so I was absent during the school year for 4 years, and then after that in college. But always there would be, I would return here in the holidays and worked on the farms in the summer times, even when I was in school from the time I was pretty small. Played on the farms before that.
Mm-hmm. Where did you go to school?
I went to school here in Newcastle through the 8th grade, and then I was sent to a school known as Millersburg Military Institute, MMI, which stood for Mothers Marching Idiots, according to some people.
My dad sent me some questions that he wanted me to ask you, and so I'm gonna preface this by, in the back end of the question in quotations, he says, "Dad wants to hear this." So, could you tell us a little bit about your time at Stanford and your friendship with Wallace Stegner?
Well, I had the great good fortune to receive a writing fellowship to Stanford in 1958. Tony and I were married by then, and our daughter was a baby. And we went out to Stanford. It was my first trip. Tanya's a California girl. She was born out there, and a lot of her growing up was done in the Bay Area. And but this was new country to me, and I was raised to think that a bluegrass pasture was the ultimate in landscape, and I pretty much resented the deserts and the Rocky Mountains and all. I wanted better pasture, but anyway, I learned to like all that. Wallace Stegner was, as I now understand, a fairly young man in those days, a very handsome man, a very, very much a man of honor and honesty. He didn't have a program to present that he expected his students to subscribe to. He didn't try to indoctrinate us in any kind of ideology, but he gave us very good criticism of our work. I didn't really come under his influence for several years, not until Tanya and I had moved back here, and I had really understood that I was going to be a placed writer, and I had to look around then for elders who could show me how to be a responsible Kentucky writer. And Wallace Stegner, of course, was an exemplary Western writer because he had taken responsibility for his region, not just as subject matter for his fiction, but as a conservationist. And so then I began to really benefit from his influence and his example. He was a thoughtful man. He was very generous, and I have an idea that I still don't know the extent to which he helped me get jobs and so on after I left Stanford. But settling here pretty much made him indispensable to me as a teacher and example in a way he hadn't been before.
Mm-hmm.
He was the kind of man whose presence made you feel like you needed to be at work.
That thing.
How about? Did we get that?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's on
Okay.
there. It just wasn't picking it up.
All
quite
right. Well, that's staggering and stuttering at the subject enough, but it's a big subject.
Mm-hmm. When did you have your first book published? What year was that?
I had a little novel called Nathan Coulter that I had started, and maybe I got the Stanford Fellowship because of the 60 or so pages I had of that book. And by the time I got out there, maybe I had more. But then I stayed through my year as a fellow, and then Mr. Stegner asked me if I would stay on as an instructor and teach a course. And that was a way to have an income. And of course, I stayed. And Tony and I both were glad enough to have another year out there. And so I'd worked pretty constantly on that little novel, and it was published just before we finally left after the second year. It was published in April 1960. And it took about 30 years for us to make significant income from my writing.
Doesn't happen overnight, does it?
No, not hardly.
Mm-hmm. Now, when your book, The Unsettling of America, was published in 1977, which was the year I was born, it's 2017 now. We're looking at 40 years.
That's right.
Are you seeing what you were expecting to be seeing today?
It's hard to talk about expectations. Well, I can't do it quickly or simply. I had what proved to be the extremely naive idea that there must be a public conversation going on about agriculture. And when Tanya and I came back here, I could see that everything I loved about this place and the ways of farming here that I'd grown up learning, all that was in jeopardy. And I thought that by writing about the situation here, I could take part in this supposed public conversation. Well, what I didn't know was that there was no public conversation about farming or land use in this country. And moreover, there is not such a conversation now.
Mm-hmm.
What I had to say was not welcome in what I would call the official forces of farming, not in the ag schools, not, of course, in agribusiness and the corporations, and not in the bureaus of the government. That I was very clearly a dissenter, and I knew that in my writing I was very much my father's son. I was my brother's brother, and I had some pretty good teachers, farmers, one in particular, who were convinced hereditary agrarians who had those values and could speak of them. But there were, outside my family and my friends here, I had no ally that I knew. And slowly, over the years, as I wrote and published, I didn't sell many copies of my books, but I picked up friends, a handful. Gene Logston in about 1970. Maury Talene in 74. Wes Jackson in 1980, and your dad in 83. And that was the force that I knew about. We were those four people were my allies and fortunately my friends. And there was something wonderfully sustaining about that shared friendship and goodwill and conversation and really quite a lot of laughter. It was, if without that, I couldn't have made it. Now, I thought by getting into the supposed public conversation, I might be able to help preserve the things that were good in my home country here. And, of course, I couldn't, and I haven't. I didn't understand how much worse the situation would be in 40 years. And I look upon that book as a tragic book because it's more relevant now than it was then. Mm-hmm. I mean, when I wrote that book, 5% of the population of our country were farming. Now it's somewhere less than 1%. And there is no public interest in these issues of land use. Nobody cares that these huge acreages of corn and soybeans, for instance, are lying bare all winter without a cover crop. The people supposedly interested in carbon sequestration and so on don't care that there's nothing green on these fields for months after months and every year, month after month every year. And they don't care that most of the rivers in rural America are polluted, are toxic. Wes Jackson lately talked to somebody who was working on this issue of the rivers and asked her if it would be true to say that there wasn't an unpolluted river in the country, and she said that is a allowable possibility, that there's not one. Wes also sent me a photocopy of a sign that he'd found in a motel in Colorado that warned pregnant women and nursing mothers not to drink the water.
You know, going back to what you were saying about, the Unsettling of America, how you were trying to get a conversation going and you ended up with some friends and nothing else.
That's right.
Being that Brian and I work in the organic industry now with a lot of farmers, I don't think you guys have any idea how much of an influence you've had in a positive way with that, where even in conventional agriculture, you are hearing a lot more about cover crops, getting something green on that field during the winter, being careful about erosion. There's a lot of positives happening right now, I see, but on a very, very small scale.
Yes.
It's not touching the big guys, but you're seeing it on the small farms.
Yeah, I know that a little bit, and it's very moving to me that the bunch of us have had an effect, even a small effect. It's very gratifying, and it's, you could perhaps regard it as hope-giving. But I've begun to warn the young people I talk to about hope. It's possible to hope too much and for the wrong things. And so I've been telling them the important thing is to find out what's right and then do it. And there's a great sustenance in that. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of farmers who know what the right way is mm-hmm. and who will tell you that they can't afford to do it.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I find encouraging with organics and within Organic Valley is there is enough of a premium there that it allows some of these farmers to go back to more sustainable practices, and then they end up realizing that, wow, this actually doesn't cost more, and it's more effective, and it's working.
It works. There's, I think it's necessary to say that our cheap food policy has been a farm-destroying policy. Food is too cheap. And so I would want to argue that efforts like Organic Valley are not putting a premium on the cost of milk, but simply bringing the price up to something like justice, fairness. Mm-hmm. Fairness would be a better word. This is a very complex situation. Food is too cheap. People are not having to pay as high a proportion of their income to eat as they ought to. But to justly complicate matters, it's necessary to say that for poor people it's too expensive. Mm-hmm. And I think we can't afford, if we want to be righteous, we can't afford to forget either of those things.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Now, we've covered a lot of ground coming up to, you settling back here after Stanford. Mm-hmm. Now, we had talked a little bit earlier about the tobacco co-op, and can you, because I do work for Organic Valley, and we do work within the cooperative structure, can you kind of explain how the tobacco growers got together and started that co-op and how their supply management. I don't think you're allowed to call it supply management anymore because that's called collusion, but it's...
Collusion?
Yeah.
Oh, well.
But it works within the cooperative structure.
We've got to talk about supply management because it makes sense. Mm-hmm. Supply management simply means that if you've got a limited supply, you need to be careful how you use it up. If it's coming to the end of winter and you've got still a month of cold and maybe a month's supply of firewood, you manage the supply. That's all there is to it. It makes sense. It's just common sense. Mm-hmm. That's the way it should be done. Economics, at root means household management. And still, I think, if we want the clues about how to have a healthy economy, we have to go to the household for our analogies. You don't cook with everything, cook all the food you have if you have a limited supply. You ration it out. That's the rule. That's the rule in household management. It's the rule in farm management. And it ought to be the rule in the management of a regional or a national economy. So if you want farmers to continue to farm, you can't use overproduction as a way to get rid of them. And that's pretty much what we've done. After World War II, the word went out from the think tanks and the government experts and so on that we had too many farmers. And a deliberate effort was made to get rid of them, to reduce the farm population, which, of course, increased the numbers in the labor pool, and it increased the numbers of consumers. If you can get all these farmers to stop raising home gardens and managing their households in that old economic way they did, that's better for the corporate suppliers. So it wasn't, they didn't reduce the number of farmers in the interest of the farmers, and they didn't do it in the interest of the farmland. It was completely irresponsible and fundamentally greedy policy.
What was the justification for too many farmers? What did they say in that report? What was the justification for too much farming?
That this miraculous industrialization was going to take place, and the farming would be done primarily by technological devices, and we wouldn't need them. Of course, that leaves out quite a lot. One of my best mentors, whom I met just in time, Henry Bissoudin, a great sheep breeder from Clark County, over by Winchester. He had a farm called Vinewood Farm that he rescued. That it was washed to pieces, and he healed it up and made it over into a great farm. He made himself into a great farmer. But Henry said, if a man loves his land, he'll save it. And that's what the policymakers, you see, forgot. If you excise love as a motive for land use, you've really brought your land into jeopardy. There's no help for it. We've got to, if we're going to put the farm situation back together, gather the scattered pieces and put them back together, we're going to have to find a way to put the scattered pieces of humanity back together too. And love is an indispensable ingredient. Mm-hmm. World of, there's plenty of it in your family. These people are working lovingly because they don't have more land than they can get around to with their love, for one reason. The scale's right. It makes love effective at a certain scale, and beyond that scale, it isn't effective. But we've also probably got to go back to that law, love thy neighbor as thyself, too, as an essential ingredient, because you can't do it by yourself. You can't succeed. You can't be whole by yourself.
Mm-hmm. On the supply management, going back to the tobacco co-op, now you had mentioned earlier that they had a minimum that they were allowed to produce, so anybody could be coming in with.
Yes.
Was that based on acreage or yield, or what were the?
We'll have to get into that in steps. The effort to make a cooperative effort that would involve the producers of burley tobacco, that's a variety. Actually, it was very much in demand as a cigarette tobacco. That effort started about 1920. And from then until 1941, it was a kind of on and off business. For the reasons that I spoke of earlier, not everybody would get in. Not everybody would cooperate. If they had a good year, that reduced their perception, that reduced the perceived value of the cooperative principle. A bad year brought it back. And what made the difference was that under the New Deal, the Roosevelt farm program made it possible for the co-op to receive a government loan against the crop. And that loan, as far as I know, was always repaid. And that really was the only government expense. It wasn't a handout. It was not some form of governmental charity. What the loan made possible was for the farmer to be paid if his crop wasn't bought by a tobacco company. To get the crop, the corporation had to pay a penny a pound above the support price. The support price was determined by the principle of parity, which was that the gainfully employed farmer ought to be able to participate in the economy about the same level as a gainfully employed city person. So they limited the supply, and they underpinned the price on the parity principle. And the buyers, the corporations that bought the crop, had to give their expected need. In other words, the co-op was informed of the likely demand and could adjust the supply to the demand.
Now, that would have started, they would have gotten those demands before the crop was planted?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And then the allotments were given out according to what was needed. If Liggett or Reynolds or American didn't buy the crop, didn't bid more than a penny a pound above the support price, then the co-op took the crop under loan and the farmer would be paid at the warehouse, just like everybody else. Mm-hmm. So there was nobody who was having to say, wait a minute, I got to have my money. They had it, you see. And the story of how they managed the supply. Now, this is a very complicated story, but at first they attempted to control the supply by allotting acreages. And these were remarkably small in comparison to the farm size. I mean, a 300-acre farm might have a 4-acre tobacco base. But at the same time, industrialization was taking part in the economy of the farms. The experts from the official forces would come out and they'd say to the farmer, well, you can only grow this many acres. Let me tell you how to grow more tobacco on those acres. And so the era of nitrogen fertilizer began in the tobacco economy. I mean, they were just practically blasting it out of the ground with nitrogen. And one of the results would be overproduction. One astonishing thing that happened was, I believe it was 1955. If there's a transcript, I can correct things like this, but I believe it was 55. They had too much tobacco in storage, and all this was done by referendum. The growers voted, and so the proposal had to go out from the co-op to the members. Would you be for a 25% reduction in production for this coming year? And they voted to do it. And that was because enough of the old ones were still around, and they knew why the co-op existed in the first place. They'd been hungry enough to know. And they voted, in effect, against themselves, you might say, except that in fact they were voting for the survival of the program and hence of their own family economy. Eventually they shifted it, and my dad worked very hard on this among the growers and in Washington. They shifted it from an acreage allotment to a poundage allotment, and that cured that part of the problem.
Because then if they knew roughly what they could produce per acre, and if they thought they could produce more per acre, it would free up acres for something else.
It just, yeah. So this, you see, tobacco was a small, at best, as it was originally. It was a crop of small acreage. And so it fitted very well into a highly diverse, very conservative way of farming here. One of the rules that we're into the culture now, no grain is going to leave my farm if it doesn't walk off. In other words, every farm was raising only the corn or whatever that it could feed. Now, they would occasionally sell the wheat that came from the cover crop on the tobacco and corn fields. But I've fed a lot of wheat to hogs back in those days. They put the wheat in the barrel and put water in it, and ferment that wheat. You'd stir it up and slop the hogs with that fermented wheat. And they didn't hesitate. They weren't finicky eaters when you put that out for them. Grind the wheat and do that, or you could do it with the whole grain, I guess, if you didn't wait for it to swell after it got inside the animal. But that fitted very well. But then this other thing was cranking up to more traction power, enabled bigger acreages. And I'm sure that, I forget the year now, they permitted the bases to be leased off the farm. And this permitted crop acreages to accumulate, where they'd had 4 or 5 acres, or maybe farming on 2 or 3 farms, 10, 15 acres. They'd have 30 or 60 or 100. And first thing you know, the Mexicans are coming in. It was originally a crop made with family labor, made with neighborhood labor, exchanges of work among neighbors. And the rule there was exemplary, perfectly Christian, although I never heard the preachers talk about it. The rule was that you joined together because alone you were not as effective. You needed your neighbors. The other rule was nobody's done till everybody's done. When you got your crop finished, you didn't quit and go home. You stayed till the last of the last crop was in the barn and safe. And if I'm remembering correctly, there was around here, the work people I work with, there was no settling up. Nobody ever got to the end and said, I owe you half a day, you owe me 2 days. This didn't happen. And so the community thrived also as a membership. So the government help, it seems to me significant that the government help was not brought in by outside experts. The co-op was formed by people like my dad who were involved in farming and involved in the communities. And they knew the people they were trying to help. They knew the crop. They knew the economy and the market. And when the government loan then came to them, they were motivated to administer it in the common interest. And it seems to me that given that way, the government loan, the help to the farmers to give them protection on the market, was a perfectly appropriate thing for the government to do. I mean, if you construe that the government ought to protect us from our enemies, that is, our military opponents, why isn't it just as reasonable that it should protect us from our economic enemies, the people who want to pillage and plunder and take away our work at no return? It's a perfectly appropriate thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
The trick, I think, is to keep the outside experts at bay.
That's a problem.
It's a problem.
It's hard to get that done.
Now, I'll tell you, I visited once a very remarkable Amish farmer up near Fort Wayne, Will Schmucker, and he had a nephew, Martin. Both of them were splendid Belgian horse breeders, among other things. But Maury Talene sent me up there because Will had made a ground-driven hay baler. And my first surprise was that this ground-driven hay baler was not a gimcrack. It was a new John Deere baler. And the gear ratios and so on had been exquisitely calculated. Had a bull wheel.
Mm-hmm.
And he could just take 8 horses and pull that baler in operation with 150 bales of hay on the wagon behind it. Of course, it's flat up there.
Mm-hmm.
But he worked 8 brood mares who were royalty in the Belgian breed. They all had colts. We left them in the barn. They didn't have an ounce of surplus flesh. They were hard, worked hard. And I bet the bunch of them didn't have $500 worth of harness altogether.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were people who were taking care of things, patching the old harness, making it work. But after, in the course of my conversation with Will, I asked him, "Do you get any help from the Extension Service?" "Oh," he said, "yes, when we have a problem, we sometimes get help from them." And I'd already started home and was some ways down the road before I understood. They defined the problem. They didn't invite the extension agent to come out and look around and see if he saw anything wrong. They defined the problem, and so they controlled the knowledge and the expertise that was applied.
Mm-hmm.
They also put on a horse show, Will and Martin. I had Den with me, and they began to lead out one splendid Belgian horse after another. Will had a great famous stallion named Constrico, and but they were absolutely tops, the two of them, and they were leading these wonderful horses out and trotting them up and down the road, and showing them to us, and it went on and on. And I finally said, "Martin, I know it's your supper time. You don't have to be showing us these horses." "Oh," he said, "around here we eat when there's nothing better to do." You see, that's of the essence of it to me.
Mm-hmm.
The excitement, the love of it.
Mm-hmm. And when you see a farmer that loves, we talked about loving the land,
Yeah.
but when you see them love the animals and the land together, you see how everything is taken care of because there's that connection to it. And that goes a long ways working with animals and the land.
Absolutely. If your work stock, if your traction power is coming from animals, then it's creatures all the way. And you love essentially the animal and the crop and the pasture in the same way, with the same kind of heart. Mm-hmm. And that keeps your motive intact across the whole spectrum of the work and the the living creatures that you're working with. So there's delight. Delight. My father gave all that time in his life to the Burley Co-op. Lots of time, lots of effort, lots of worry and thought. But his passion was grass. And he thought that for us here, in the kind of big vulnerable land we have, that the one crop we could grow year after year to our advantage was grass. So, there's that passion, that capacity to be pleased, to be delighted. Look at it, he'd say. Look at the cover on this pasture. He'd say, this is what we're going into the winter with. It took me a long time to even know what he was talking about, but there it was. He was tickled to death.
Yeah. Driving down here this morning, I saw the one farm down the road, bunch of beef cattle out, and I was like, oh, that's the grass you're talking about in the river bottoms. And then half a mile down the road, you saw that huge flat soybean field that who knows how many feet of topsoil is left that.
Well, you see, there's that whole valley side there, the bluffs, and that water that comes off there has got to cross that bottom to get to the river, and that is completely disregarded.
And when you have a field with a bunch of Kentucky 31 in it, some old fescue, that's not leaving. That's holding steady right there.
Another thing that heartens me is that if you have that Kentucky 31 fescue on a hillside like this one behind the house, you can't get rid of it.
No.
But the bluegrass will persist along with it, and the clover. So there's that good. Your dad's book is full of delight.
That's going back to, you talked about using horsepower and how then the whole farm's connected to a living thing. I don't think Dad would nearly have the stories if he didn't have to rest the horses at the end of the field and lay there on his back looking at migrating hawks and doing all this stuff. And same thing with the family lunchtime. The horses need a break. You go in and you eat dinner with the family. So, in the way their farms are set up, it just makes perfect sense. Yeah. Unfortunately, we've come so far that is not reality to 99% of the farmers out there. I mean, it just when you dig yourself a hole that big, what do you do?
Well, you talk to some of these farmers, these very large-scale farmers, profitability is not something they're worried about. It's just cash flow. And what is cash flow? It just means that they need to do more and more and more and more. And it's like the story you told before lunch. They need more land, so they need a bigger tractor. Well, then they need more land to support that bigger tractor. And it's
a bigger tractor to farm that much land. And they've got their computers in their hands all the time, finding out moment to moment how they're doing. And it changes. They just will be in Las Vegas.
Playing the slots.
Except they ain't having as much fun as people think they're having.
Well, they're losing as much money, though.
Wes asked your dad your dad told Wes, I read Sand County Almanac while I was plowing. Wes said, oh, you mean you read it while you rested the horses? Well, David said, I did that for a while, but then I got so interested in the book, I read and plowed at the same time. Well, you see, that reveals a lot because there were more than one mind involved. And David was benefiting from his team's knowledge of how to plow. He didn't have to look all the time to keep his furrow horse in the furrow, you see. And I'm thinking more and more in terms of the economic value of intangibles. Now, there David's education was coming to him by courtesy of his of having a smart team and a well-broke team. But sheep don't naturally come to the fold at night. You can train them to. And if your fold is down the hill, their instinct is telling them to spend the night up at the top of the hill. Very good for the ground because, the drainage off the roosting place fertilizes the slope below. But if you got a predator problem, the way we do here, you got to get them down into the fold. They learn to come. They learn to come, and they come. I've got a dog. I can send the dog out, but they know already when they see the dog coming what they're going to have to do. And it pays off. It shortens the time that I have to spend doing that work. And I've been telling people, the cattle market goes down, people get rid of all their cows. Then too many of them, buy in when the price goes up again. So they have them in production just in time for it to go down again. But
nothing more short-sighted than a farmer, right?
You bring a bunch of big animals on your farm, and they don't know where they are or where the gates are or what they're supposed to do or what to expect from you. You're going to pay for that. Mm-hmm. You're going to pay for it with gates, fences, trouble, time.
Yeah.
So there's no way to measure their knowledge. Some time ago, a man named James Rebank was here, and James Rebank wrote a wonderful book called The Shepherd's Life, I think. Either A Shepherd's Life or The Shepherd's Life. I think it's The Shepherd's Life. And he lives in the Lake District in northern England, a famous tourist draw. For this landscape's very beautiful. The Romantic poets, owed a lot to that country. But he produces the only thing that can be produced in that very difficult mountainous landscape, and that is a breed of sheep called Herdwick. They have very coarse wool, but they can live in that country on the feed that country produces. And for hundreds and hundreds of years, that's been so. So you've got 3 cultures operating there. Oh, one thing they do there is called hefting. Sheep that are born on a certain definable part of the landscape always live on there. They know where they belong. So you've got 3 cultures operating there. A human culture, a sheep culture, because they're generation after generation on the same land, and a dog culture. Mm-hmm. So the shepherd and his sheep and his dog are all operating, making that landscape productive for human good out of a cultural resource. If it weren't for the cultural resource, it couldn't be done. Mm-hmm. It's just wonderful, and it's satisfyingly complicated. You'd say, well, now send your expert in here and beat this.
He couldn't.
Couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't.
They think they could.
Well,
I bet they think they could.
But you take him 500 yards up into the country, he couldn't find his way home.
He'd take his GPS along.
I'm sorry?
He'd take his GPS along.
Oh, yeah,
to find his way back.
Yeah, now. Yeah.
The expert knows best, right? Just ask him.
That's right.
But, yeah.
That's right. Well, they used to be, when they were, I was just remembering the other night, back in the day when the tobacco allotments were in acres, they'd send a lot of high school and college boys made money in the summer by surveying the tobacco patches, and some could get along and some had a little trouble. But there was a story about this fellow that went to this farm up in the mountains, and he had come to survey the tobacco. And the farmer said, "Sure, you're welcome. There's the tobacco crop. Go right to it," and so on. But if I were you now, I wouldn't go in that holler up there. Well, the young man said, "I have a card in my pocket. It means that I can go any place on your farm that I want to." Well, the farmer said, "Go to it." So he went on in the house and he ate his dinner. And when he came out, here this boy came out of the forbidden holler with the bull right on his heels. He's pumping along and he hollered, "Help, help, help." The farmer said, "Show him your card."
Oh, that's great. So we touched on a lot of things coming up to it. Now I want to kind of go back to, the Unsettling of America. And now, do you think that the advent of GMOs and the glyphosate resistant, the Roundup Ready crops, do you think, has that changed your outlook?
No.
Has that had negative, positive, neutral effect on what was happening with land use?
That it only increases the displacement of the farmer from the farm. It seems to me that what's involved is a kind of death wish. That we're wishing all the time against our physical existence. Somehow the ideal is to have a job that doesn't involve any work. And farmers feel like they're as entitled to that as anybody else.
Less work and more pay.
Less work and more pay, or no work.
Yeah, and all the pay. Yeah.
Pay or whatever. And but as I've suggested in talking about this, the creatureliness of it, what's necessary to good use of the land is love or affection, however you'd want to say it. And this involves bodily contact, presence. I mean, what a farmer can learn from walking across the field through his feet. He knows the condition of the ground. West talks about the eyes to acres ratio, which means that if the eyes to acres ratio is right, the farmer or the rancher doesn't have more land than he or she can look at and with understanding.
I think that's a key right there, is look at with understanding. You can look at a lot of land. It doesn't mean you're understanding what's going on there.
This changes the human understanding of the land from scenery to, well, it changes the nature of the land and the farmer's understanding from scenery to a fellow creature.
Mm-hmm. Something that's alive, that needs to be nurtured and loved,
yes.
Same as any child.
We could say a member of the family.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this is extremely important. As for the GMOs, what we're really talking about is the necessity for local adaptation. And it's a wonder to me that all the biology that the farm experts and so on have studied hasn't told them that humans, too, are subject to this law, this need for local adaptation. So I think any good farmer will tell you that what will work on the neighbor's farm might not work on my farm.
Mm-hmm.
Or he'll know that in this thing that looks like one field, there may be 3 or 4 different kinds of land spots, they call them. Well, there's a spot out there that's kind of waxy when it turns up.
Mm-hmm.
So what the Monsanto approach, one seed and one herbicide for any place, is completely opposed to that need for local adaptation.
And it's strictly monoculture, because you can only control if you're going with a monoculture. Because if you have a diverse field with all these diverse plants in there, there's no way to chemically feed that or kill stuff unless it is strictly mono.
Well, and that's another way of saying it's extremely simplified.
Mm-hmm.
The imposition of an extremely simple system on an extremely complicated original ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no room in it for any sensitivity at all. You can learn to farm the Monsanto way if you don't read anything but the owner's manuals and the instructions on the bottles and the bags.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to know your land.
And, isn't that kind of what they sell that product on? I mean, essentially, it made farming easier. And it goes back to, like you were saying earlier, we want less work, more pay.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the shtick that the big ag companies have sold these products on, but it's gone the opposite direction.
The problem is the farmer doesn't control the ratio between work and pay.
Yeah.
The suppliers control that
Mm-hmm.
ratio. And so there's a lot of frustration in it, a lot of suffering, actually. I know that these farmers are handling an immense amount of money or credit, but it's going straight through them like a dose of salt.
Yep. And it doesn't even stop at the community level either. I mean, that's the part that
It carries
also
it out
gets
of the
us.
county,
Yep.
carries it out of the state.
Yep.
It's gone.
It's just like a siphon right from the bank to the supplier.
Well, here we've got some forest. You can look up and down the river. You're looking at thousands of acres of forest on these valley sides, and they're logging them really pretty heartlessly. But you can imagine a forest economy in a place like this that would start with the care of the living forest, the standing forest, and it would go on from that to the people who would log it, the horses, the people who would supply the horses, people who grow feed for the horses, people who, you'll see, the blacksmiths, the farriers, the harness makers. It would become elaborate locally. And as you elaborated that structure, that economic structure, you would increase the number of people who are working in effect, who are acting in effect as a lobby for the good care of the local forest. I think that's what we had. Well, think about Mount Hope, mm-hmm. in those little towns up there in Holmes County. There's still that web that connects the farmers and the merchants and the
mm-hmm.
repair people and so on.
Well, on one of our recordings with Mike's dad, he said, he told the story of going to the post office, and the postmaster was, was counting the money for the day, and he had these worn out $1 bills, and he said, "You guys never leave town." And David just said, that's the point. This money is staying in the community.
That's right.
And that's why those small communities thrive.
Yeah.
Is because the local farmer is spending money at the local business, and it makes its round.
Right.
And that's stopped. I mean, we drove through. I don't know what this little town just up north of us, English, I think it was.
English. Well, that's a railroad town, you see.
Well, it looks like it's seen its better days.
Yes, it has. Now that English, you see, is built on, there's slough hollers there. And they're just built on a set of backbones. And most of those houses don't have backyards. So you hardly get through English because of the kids and the playing and the people gossiping and so on out in the road.
I still remember when Walmart first came to town, how Dad was devastated.
Yeah.
Because he said every evening that money is wired to Bentonville, Arkansas.
That's right.
Sucked right out of the community.
Yeah.
He said it is a big vacuum, and it really didn't. I didn't understand really what he was talking about until years later.
Yeah.
The money that is worked so hard for within the community, they get the money, and just like that, it's gone. And when you look at all the little shops that we have in Holmes County that they survive because of the local economy that is there, and to know that you are doing permanent damage to the community by spending your money at the Walmarts. And I wish there was some way we could educate people on that, because most people don't think.
Well, what we've educated out of our people is the idea that a living isn't enough, or a decent living isn't enough. We'd have taught people to prefer what we call a killing, which produces conspicuous spending and too much leisure. And
well, we talked about cheap food earlier as well, and the reason our country loves cheap food is because then you can have extra money to go spend it on dumb stuff you don't need.
yes,
That supposedly is going to make you happy and bring fulfillment.
I got a letter from a fellow that I've referred to a number of times. He was raised in the Licking River Valley over here. The Licking River goes into the Ohio opposite Cincinnati. He was raised over there by an old uncle, I think, an old elder, in the tobacco patches. And he wrote to me because he thought I'd be interested, and I was. He was right. People wonder what comes after the tobacco program. I can tell you what comes after the tobacco program: dope and addiction. It had happened to him because the kids are no longer being raised by their elders, neighbors, family members, and so on. They don't have an economic place. They're not useful anywhere. So this sort of thing needs to be thought about very carefully. Now, in my book, I told about Newcastle in 1946. That's the year after World War II. It had a population of about 650 people. And it had 55 commercial and professional offerings. It put an ad in the local paper for itself as a place to come and shop. It had 4 grocery stores, 2 hardware stores, 4 places that worked on cars and sold gas, 2 blacksmith shops, I don't know, on and on. And then the lawyers and doctors and whatnot. Well, it was a great place for a boy to grow up. You could you could make 50 cents a week distributing bills from the grocery store. Or you could have a paper route. Or, well, one of the grocers hired me one time to trap rats. I don't think I made but about $1.50, but he gave me 50 cents a rat. But that kind of thing, you see, you were in on the life of the town. There were many ways to get involved in the life of the community, economic ways, not just freedom to play wherever you want to, if you were a boy anyway. 55 places. And then you were the kids, they were known. My brother and I used to, when we were building things, we were always doing something in the order of construction. We'd mark our boards and carry them around to the blacksmith shop, because they always had their saws sharp around there.
Mm-hmm.
And they tolerated it, have a kid in there.
So I know this is going to be a really huge, probably unanswerable question. Okay. But in going back to the unsettling, what do you see in 40 years from now? You've seen the last 40 up to today. Do you see, I mean, I know it's a hard question, but do you see the similar amount of change happening, or are we tapped out on destroying it at this rate?
I think, we must be approaching a limit of some kind where things will begin to go backwards, or they'll get better in a more authentic way. One of the essays in my new book is called "Leaving the Future Behind." And I began to argue against this obsession that we have with the future, because we're so often wrong about it, and we abuse the future. I mean, we pass our debts to the future, and we assume, this is perfectly superstitious of us and really makes us look bad, we assume that we can go on making the mistakes that we're making, because in the future the technology will be better and the humans a lot smarter. And so we'll just hand them these problems. Mm-hmm. This is terrible behavior. It's horrible behavior. So what I can tell you is that a book like The Unsettling of America, the books of publications, things that's written by Gene, Maury, Wes, your dad, I can tell you for sure that those people have instructed my children. And so Mary started this, what she calls the Berry Center. Mm-hmm. It started because she realized that all that work that my dad and his friends had done was forgotten. People were just treating it as of the past and therefore of no interest. And so there's that. And they are working. I mean, it's of very material interest to them that Organic Valley started out with 7 farmers. So there are these things in the wind, that are right. That's all you have. That's all you have a right to ask, if it's right or not. Mm-hmm. Mary has a daughter now who's involved up there in the Berry Center. She's running the bookstore, but also organizing reading groups, reading agrarian books. I didn't expect to see this in my lifetime, and it's happening. And this is not just because of my influence or my dad's or my brother's. It's Gene's and my friends, those four men. Their influence is leaking in here.
That's when we sat down with Wes. We actually it was the night before a dinner. I asked him, when kind of the five horsemen, who's going to step in and take over for you, you and your friends. And Wes said, well, you guys are doing that right now. And I'm like, well, it doesn't seem like I'm doing anything here. But it seems like what you and your friends have started has grown into something where it's not just five people anymore. It's thousands and thousands of people that are seeing the importance of this. And I think there's actually enough positive things happening now that it gives me hope.
Well, you see, you're indicating in various ways that you don't feel this burden that you're carrying, and that's because it's internal. It's not a pack on your back that somebody's filled up with information and instruction. It's inside you. It's in your heart. And we had those. My four friends and I had the old agrarianism in our hearts. And when I met your dad, we just started talking. There was so much that we knew in common and that we felt in common that didn't need to be explained. There we were in a hallway at Oberlin, all these kids going around us this way and that way, and we were talking. The same way with all the others. I mean, you didn't have to say, now I've got this agrarianism on my mind. You just knew it. Mm-hmm. Old Gene turned up here. He very improbably was working for Farm Journal, living in Philadelphia. I had just fairly recently come home, and I published a book of poems called Farming a Handbook, which some publicist, of course, had sent to Farm Journal, which it was displaced. It was as out of place there as Gene was. But Gene got it. He picked the book up, and he began to read it. Well, this guy, I need to talk to him. And so he turned up here. Well, we just started talking. And so I was getting from him the confirmation that he got from his mother that confirmed what I'd got from my father and his father and so on. So that's the way it's going to work. Mm-hmm. People have it in their hearts. They'll do what their hearts tell them. Some of them will. Mm-hmm. And that's all you can ask. It's all you can ask. It's very lovely. It's beautiful. Mm-hmm. If it's beautiful, it's fine. My great suspicion of a lot of this clean energy technology is that it's ugly. A field full of solar panels is doing, I'm sure, a very good thing, but it's horrible. Mm-hmm. I mean, what's going on under it? If you've got to have it, you ought to put it up here and put the sheep on the ground under it or something. Mm-hmm. And then these great big old wind machines, good gracious. Yeah. They're horrible to me. Have you seen them out west there?
Yeah. Well, in western Ohio, when you go out 30 past Upper Sandusky, they've got hundreds of them out there.
Yeah.
And they are kind of an eyesore.
Well, you know what Wes would ask you? Will they, in their lifetime, make enough energy to reproduce themselves?
I would say the answer is probably no.
Well, nobody knows, you see. It's another thing. We talk very convincingly to ourselves. Well, this is the answer. We humans, one thing we're very good at is misleading ourselves. Mm-hmm. And we're very superstitious in that way. David Ehrenfeld wrote a book called The Arrogance of Humanism one time, and he talked about the folly of relying on what he called end product analysis, because making fun of the polysyllabic language. End product analysis. Well, after we got to the end product, then we can subtract cost from price, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Nobody says ahead of time, oh, be careful.
No, because this is the next great thing, right?
That's right. This is the next great thing, and somebody's going to put some money in his pocket because of it.
But you mentioned that kind of what got you through, finding the other 4 friends that sustained you through being a spokesperson for the agrarian lifestyle, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it. On the, like Mike was saying, on the bright side, it's not a pack that's on our back to try and continue that word, because there is a groundswell of people, and it's absolutely in the positions we're in. We work with farmers that live that lifestyle. So that makes it a lot easier too. But then there's also this other groundswell of people that have been far away from farms for what I think is like instinctually too long. They're feeling the call to come back.
That's very true. And that's why the conversation that we give them has to be kind and also critical, because nobody gets to the point where he doesn't need criticism. That is the judgment. Now, it's been of enormous worth to me as a public advocate and going and speaking in meetings is one to have my brother. And I'd call him up and I'd say, I'm about to say this. Can I say that? Or I'd send him a draft. And I'd say, would you read this and tell me whether I can say this or not? And sometimes he'd say, put it on him. And sometimes he'd say, Wendell, I agree with everything you say, but I think we better talk. I took all that seriously, He'd say, you're saying it, but this is the wrong place to say it. And this is invaluable. Or I'd say, call up Wes, and I'd be verging over into something scientific, I'd say, Wes, can I say this? Well, if I began to hear that, then I had to take up on my bit, and say, well, tell me how far I can go. Or every time I've mentioned the Amish, I send something to David. Can I say this?
Well, you can call me like the people I work with do.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you got to have somebody you can call.
Because we run into the same thing where we're talking about Organic Valley and organic farming, and we have some things that I might think is really important to talk to the farmers about, but I need to vet it through with somebody who can tell me, I'm not sure you want to go there, or yes, you're right on track. Because if you don't talk to people smarter than yourself, you're never going to stay accurate on the path you need to be.
That's right. And that's why my brother, knowing me, would say, I think we better talk.
And that's why I'm so lucky that I have Dad to bounce things off of.
To have that backing.
It's so invaluable.
You see, what we're getting this down to finally is the ability to talk about scale. And what we know, I can tell you, I know this from my experience as a writer and from what I know of farming. If you get the scale right, you're going to get the form right. And the form of a good farm is just as complex, just as demanding as the form of a good novel. It really is. It's as high a feat intellectually and imaginatively as any other art. It's there at that point. It's an art, and it's a very high art. And then, as I suggested, we've got to learn to talk about intangibles. Finally, whether you love your farm or not has an economic outcome. It just does.
Because it's really hard to put everything you have within you into something you don't love.
Absolutely.
You know, if you love something, you're going to nurture and you're going to take care of it. And if you don't care about it, you're not going to take care of it.
Or even worse, it's just an economic engine to get to your end goal of money.
Well, there's a kind of miracle that happens. I've experienced it over and over again since I was a little boy. My daddy could be very demanding. He was a hell of a critic. He had very high standards, and he was afraid for me as his child, you know. And so I got a lot of criticism from my dad. But when I was a little boy, he wanted me to go with him on some farm expedition, and I wouldn't want to go. In the first place, I liked my mother at one period better by far than I did him when I wanted to. For another thing, I was comfortable with what I was doing. And he had enough sense, if he took me with him, to give me something to do. And first thing you know, I'd be into it. And everything would be fine. If he hadn't done that, there would have been this estrangement between us. Mm-hmm. But here, I need your help. But still, a lot of my work has been done indoors because I've had to sit down somewhere. And in the wintertime, you know, to have to get up out of a comfortable room, nice and warm and all that, and go out somewhere and fix a fence, you know, and you know in a few minutes you won't be able to feel your fingers and so on, and it's going to be awful, and you're telling yourself how awful it's going to be. In 5 minutes, it's just dandy. Mm-hmm. Same in the heat. Here you are in a fairly cool place, nice breeze blowing, and you've got to get out there in this bruising heat. This river valley is just a steamer. It's awful. And you go out, and you know, and you may have to use a little force, and you go out and you shed a little sweat. You get into it, and it's just fine. There's no problem.
I had to go. My steers are up in a field where there's no water, so it freezes every day. So I just haul hot water up to them in a tank, but I've got to chip out the ice. And yesterday afternoon, you know, it was really nice and warm in the house, and it was about 20-mile-an-hour wind and 25 degrees. And I was dreading it. Once I got up there and did it, I actually stood there and watched the steers drink water. And like 10 minutes later, I'm like, you know, this isn't nearly as cold as I had expected it to be. Because I was, well, hopefully my heifer isn't freshening today, but it looked like she's going to freshen any day. But I just wanted to look at her, and it just made me love what I've got.
Yeah. That happens over and over with me. I won't want to go feed my lambs. And I'm going to do it just as fast as I can and get back to the house. And first thing you know, I find that I've got my elbows up on the gate, and I'm watching them eat their supper.
Yep.
Well, you know, the first rule about cutting ice for your stock is don't stand and chop all around yourself.
Oh, yeah.
A fellow like around here did that.
Oh, boy. Do you want to talk a little bit about the Berry Center and kind of what you've got, what your daughter Mary's got going on with it? And
Well, now, Mary is really the authority on the Berry Center, and if you want to talk to her, she'll be glad to talk with you. Okay. And you should call her up. All I can tell you about the Berry Center is that it's far beyond anything I ever expected, and that Mary is. Well, I'm not surprised. She's my daughter, and I've known her all her life. but she's just astonishingly good at talking to people and talking to audiences and that sort of thing, and dealing with people. And I'm just very proud of her and the Berry Center and all those people who work up there. It's just a great thing. But you ought to talk to Mary because she knows how it works and what in detail what they're trying to do.
Maybe we should talk to her and get a little, and when we put this out, have a plug in here for the Berry Center.
Well, it's just a deliverance for me in a way. I mean, here it is right here. Mm-hmm. Organic Valley is a kind of a deliverance for me. I mean, it means that my values can work in the world. They can prove out economically and agronomically and however they need to do it. But then here's the Berry Center right here, looking around and saying something needs to be done for these farmers in Henry County. And this is a very big deal for my soul. Mm-hmm. But I could hardly be more proud or more grateful. And my granddaughter, as I say, she's into it too. I don't know if there are these grandchildren around, and what they're going to do finally is an interesting question. But
well, Wendell, I think we're going to wrap it up. We've taken more than enough of your time.
Well,
really
you haven't taken any more than I'm delighted to give you.
Well, I really do appreciate it. Yes.
This was a delight sitting down with you.